Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Intrepid Museum's live virtual programming. Thank you so much for joining us today for our Journey to Space program. We're so happy that you're here. My name is Alicia, and I'm an educator at the Intrepid Sea, Air, and Space Museum in New York City. I'll be your host for today. And just as a reminder, the museum's live streams are free, but if you'd like to support us in delivering our content, please do click on the link in the comments or in the description. Again, though, feel free to use the chat today to say hello. This is a live program. Let us know where you're tuning in from, and also let us know if you've ever been to the Intrepid Museum before, or maybe if you plan on visiting us sometime soon. We have a lot of really exciting stuff coming up, and I'll tell you about it in just a bit. But at the museum, everyone, our mission is to honor our heroes, educate the public, and inspire our youth. And today we are going to do all three of those things on our journey to space. So that's right, we are going to be talking all about Intrepid's connection to space, why we are a space museum, and we're also going to talk a bit about the history of the space program here in America. And I'm also actually going to fill you in on some really cool space facts along the way. But first, for those of you who may not be familiar, this is the Intrepid Museum. So we are located in a historic World War II era aircraft carrier, the USS Intrepid. It was constructed in 1943, and it's now actually docked right off the shoreline of Manhattan on the Hudson River. So maybe you visited before, or maybe you're looking forward to visiting us in person in the future soon. But either way, if you are in the neighborhood, it is kind of hard to miss. The Intrepid is actually so big that if you were to stand it up on its end, it would actually be taller than a New York City skyscraper. And it's actually so long that you could play 3 games of football on it pretty much at the exact same time. Now, I did mention that the Intrepid, of course, served in 3 wars, World War II, the Cold War, and the Vietnam War. And then it was retired back in 1974 before a few years later, in 1982, becoming the Intrepid Sea, Air, and Space Museum that we all know and love. And by the way, it's our 40th anniversary as a museum this year. Isn't that cool? But sometimes, people come and they say, all right, I get why you're a sea museum. No, you're a Navy ship, right? Get why you're an air museum. I see those planes. But why space? Why are you also a space museum too? So let's recap. Of course, we are a sea museum. You can see there we are a naval ship. In fact, the giant artifact that you have on display in that picture there too might bring that to life a little bit more for you as well. That thing we're looking at here is, of course, a propeller. A giant propeller. In fact, one of 4 that were on the Intrepid that pushed it through the water. So yeah, sea museum. But of course, there's also different types of propellers, right? So if you look at this, here's actually another type of propeller that you might find on this plane, or on this ship rather. It's in front of the plane. This is part of the reason why we are an air museum. So the Intrepid carried a number of airplanes on it all throughout history. In fact, they could fit up to about 100 planes inside that ship at any given time. And it also had the ability to launch and to land those planes at the same time. So, just like you might do at an airport. And it's for that reason we actually kind of refer to it as a floating airport. So this plane that we're looking at here is actually the Avenger from World War II. It's the oldest plane that we happen to have on display. One of my favorites there. Later on, though, of course, we had some better technology. Things got a little more complicated, and we had jet planes, just like this one. So this is called the Fury. Definitely a cool plane from the Cold War era. And those were around a little bit later. They also moved a lot faster. But so we have jet planes on board. We've got all sorts of cool stuff like that. We've also got helicopters that were used to rescue people from the ocean. So yeah, clearly we are also an air museum because we have a lot of cool airplanes and we have a lot of cool helicopters. And again, launched and landed right from the ship. But maybe we're still not entirely sure why we're still a space museum too. Anyone have any guesses out there? You can go ahead and put it in the chat for me if you do. But to start us off about our space question here, everyone take a look at this thing here. Does anyone know what this is here? We are looking at this big, black, kind of almost light bulb shaped thing. All right, if you look closely there, you might even see it says United States on it. It's got a flag, looks like the United States flag. So some people, when they look at this, they say it kind of looks like an ice cream cone, sort of tilted on its side. Maybe even a megaphone, something that you shout into to make your voice louder. This thing that we're looking at here, though, everyone, is a very, very special vehicle that has to do with space. This is called a space capsule. And it's the thing, one of the things that took astronauts up into space many, many years ago. Now, capsules ride up on top of a rocket. The rocket, of course, that thing that goes up into space. You've seen a lot of rocket launches recently in the news, too. Of course, you see lots of fire coming out of the bottom to help to propel it way up into the sky. But then once it gets up into space, that capsule will separate from the rocket, and that capsule will stay up there and continue to float around in outer space. Now, here's a question. Why were we even going into space in the first place? Well, in the 1960s, everyone, during that Cold War era, NASA, our space program, was part of something called the space race. So we were in a space race against the Soviet Union. And, when you're in a race, usually there's a finish line, right? Well, the ultimate finish line of that race was to see which country could get all the way to the moon first. But of course, there's a number of steps that you have to take before you get to the moon. You don't just roll out of bed and end up on the moon, right? As cool as that would be. Now, first you have to figure out things like how to launch, how to get up into space. You have to build those rockets, right? Then once you're up there, you got to think about things like, how do you breathe up there? You got to take oxygen with you, right? Also, things like if you're going to be out there for a long time, you need to figure out how to eat, how to sleep, how to work over long periods of time. And then, of course, there's the situation of docking with other spacecraft, landing on the moon. You get the idea. A laundry list of things that they had to get done. So these capsules were part of some of those early steps, what they actually called Project Mercury, which was really just to see if people could even get into outer space and survive up there for a while. Now, this one is actually a replica of one of those early capsules, a replica of the Mercury Aurora VII capsule. And taking a look at this thing, everyone, let me know in the chat, how many people do you think could fit inside of this capsule? Take a good close look at that there and take a guess for me. How many people do you think could fit inside? And while you're taking a guess, I'll also tell you why they decided to name it Project Mercury. Now, Mercury, first of all, in Roman mythology, Mercury was the messenger god. He was known for being really, really fast, all right? He was kind of like their mailman. And the planet Mercury, of course, that you can see here, was actually named after that Roman god. But it's more than that, too. Mercury actually is our fastest planet as well. So 1 year on Mercury takes only 88 days, while here on Earth, of course, our year is 365 days. That's how long it takes for us to go around the sun once. So NASA wanted to be the first and the fastest to get to the moon. So they thought, yeah, Mercury's the first planet in our solar system, and it's the fastest planet. Perfect name. So that's what they named it. So back to the Aurora 7, everyone. You can probably tell just by looking at it. Yeah. It's not very big. I see some guesses in the chat. We said 4, 2, 3, all kind of all over the place there. But looking at it, yeah, actually, everyone, it only held 1 astronaut inside of it. So if any of you out there said 1, you would be correct. Now, in 1962, the astronaut who went up into space in this Aurora 7 capsule was named Scott Carpenter. And here he is right next to the Mercury Atlas rocket that took him into space. Again, lots and lots of fire coming out of there, right on the bottom. So Scott Carpenter was actually only up in outer space for about 5 hours. While he was up there, he orbited around the Earth 3 times before eventually then splashing down into the Atlantic Ocean. And back then, and actually still today, now that we've come back to launching capsules from America, they decided, yeah, splashing down into the water would actually be smart because it's a nice kind of softer landing surface than landing, in the desert or on a mountain or on someone's house or anything like that. So also it's pretty easy to aim for because there's a lot of water on the Earth, right? So they decided they were going to land these capsules in the water. But I will say this, everyone. Let me ask you this too. If you're going to land something that big in the ocean, what do you do next? You can't just leave them there, right? You got to go pick up the astronaut and their capsule. You can't just leave them stranded. So that's what they did. They would have to send out helicopters to rescue them. And as you can see in this picture, here's a helicopter. But in the particular case of Scott Carpenter, when they sent out the helicopter to rescue him, he wasn't where he was supposed to be. They couldn't find him. And they got worried, actually. They thought they'd lost him. But don't worry, they found him. But the reason that he was so off course was because while he was wrapping up his mission, Scott Carpenter had gotten a little distracted by some of his experiments. Also, he fired his re-entry thrusters just a couple seconds too late. And as a result, he ended up splashing down over 200 miles off course. So it really adds up. Definitely a lot further away than where they were expecting to find him. But fortunately, eventually, they were able to track him down, and he was, again, just fine. So they picked him up. They took him to the closest airport that happened to be in the water, which just happened to be the Intrepid. So there you go. So actually, here are some fun pictures of him on board the ship. These are some photos from our collection. And there he is on the left, surrounded by officers and onlookers on board the Intrepid right after being picked up from his capsule in 1962. A very momentous occasion. And look at that slick Mercury era spacesuit. Love all that silver and bling. And so, ladies and gentlemen, this is the reason why we are a space museum. The Intrepid played a very important role in retrieving astronauts and their capsules after they returned from outer space. So, before we move on, everyone, I want to see if we have any questions. So feel free to ask in the chat if you have any questions. And while you're doing that, actually, I do want to point out one other thing. Let me make this bigger for you. Check out that picture on the right of Scott Carpenter. He's walking around on the decks inside of the Intrepid, right where you could be walking around too if you happen to come visit us. And if you look at his feet, you'll see he's actually wearing a pretty sweet pair of cons. So you see, astronauts wear sneakers just like the rest of us. There you go. So let's see if we've got any questions, everyone. What is our questions here? So why were they called astronauts? Great question. So NASA actually got that word from a naming tradition that started off with the Argonauts. All right. And we were talking, about mythology and stuff, right? So the Argonauts, if you ever heard of, Jason and the Argonauts, right? The root word of that, naut, N-A-U-T, the Latin root there, it means sailor. So if you are familiar with mythology, those guys on Jason and the Argonauts, right? They sailed around in the ship called the Argo. And the Argo sailors were in search of the golden fleece in that story, right? But that naming tradition really continued on. So you had Argonauts, sailors of the Argo. And then it continued on after we left the oceans and started going into the sky, but not quite space yet. You had people like aeronauts, right? So those are people who pioneered flying in things like hot air balloons, right? So aeronauts, they were up in the sky. So then astronauts would mean sailor of the stars, astro. So there you go. That's actually where that name comes from. What a great question. All right. Any others? Did Scott Carpenter leave the capsule when he was in space? No, actually, he did not. So again, this was very early missions of the Mercury project. And they actually did not start doing these extravehicular activities, EVAs or spacewalks, really, until the Gemini program. So that was the next phase after Mercury, which we'll talk about in just a second. And the first American astronaut to do that actually was Ed White in 1965. So a few years after Scott Carpenter. He did not get to go out and walk around in space. However, he actually did get to put some of his astronaut skills to a different type of work later on. He became, speaking of our naming tradition, he became something called an aquanaut. So, not sailor, right? Which you think, aqua, water sailor, kind of seems a little redundant, right? But basically, what that meant was that he lived and worked under the ocean for a while. So he actually got to live, like SpongeBob, in a pineapple under the sea, but not in a pineapple. He actually got to live and work deep under the ocean for a while as an aquanaut. So another kind of interesting, cool job that, he could translate his astronaut skills into. So everyone, moving on here, I mentioned that we picked up the Aurora VII capsule, but that actually wasn't the only one. I mentioned earlier, of course, the next series of missions, the Gemini missions, all right? And those were named Gemini after the constellation of Gemini, which is, of course, the twins, if you are familiar. And, if you look at this picture here, you can really see why. All right, so looking at this picture here now, you will see this is the first time that NASA started sending 2 astronauts up into space together inside of this capsule. So it was a little bit bigger than the Mercury capsule that we just looked at. And on board the Gemini 3 mission, we had John Young, who you can see on the left, and Gus Grissom, who you can see on the right of the picture on the right there. So those 2 astronauts went into outer space. They also orbited the Earth 3 times. And then next, same as before, they splashed down into the Atlantic Ocean. So here's a picture of the Intrepid actually retrieving the Gemini capsule from the ocean in 1965. But this mission also has a funny story associated with it that we love to tell. And actually, Vashton, I see we have somebody in the comments who was beating me to the punch here about this story. So I did mention earlier that these missions had a lot of experiments going on, right? There were a lot of tests. They were experimenting with the human body in space. They were looking at things like solar flares and color visibility and making all of these observations of our planet. But on this particular mission, they were also testing out space food. Now, I don't know if anyone knows anything about space food. A lot of people think it's stuff. Oh, actually, I have some right here. A lot of people think it's something like this, it's astronaut ice cream stuff. Have you ever had this before? It's kind of like freeze dried, it's crumbly, right? But real astronaut food didn't actually look like this. Real astronaut food looked something more like this, all right? So if I make this bigger for you here, all right, looking at this picture here, this is actually a meal package from the Gemini program. And on the left, we've got some dehydrated beef pot roast, first of all. In the center there, we've got some orange juice in a plastic pouch. And then on the right, on the bottom there are some cubes of toasted bread and dehydrated bacon and egg bites. So, perfect balanced breakfast, right? Now, it looks a little funny. Maybe that's not what your breakfast looks like every morning. You might also notice that there's some hands in the top of this picture here. And those hands are injecting water into the pot roast pouch to reconstitute it. You basically are adding liquid, just add water, and then mixing it all up, mashing it all up to make it more edible. Yum, right? So everything was, dry. They didn't want to have to take all this extra water up with them because that would actually take up a lot of space. It would be more weight also to take on too. So they took up this dehydrated stuff, added the water once they were there, mashed it up. The textures, often were kind of like, baby food almost. So understandably, the astronauts weren't really a fan of this plastic pouched dehydrated food stuff. So right before their mission, John Young actually snuck on board a corned beef sandwich. And when they got up into orbit, he pulled it out and he started to eat it. He even offered some to his friend Gus too. Now, that might not sound too crazy. Here on Earth, that might not be a problem. You just eat a sandwich and throw away the evidence, right? If you've got any crumbs coming off your sandwich, it just falls down on your lap, brush it on the floor, feed it to the dog, right? But in space, things are a little different, right? And that's actually a really bad idea, even kind of a dangerous one, to bring something like a corned beef sandwich up into space. So basically what happened was as soon as they started to eat that sandwich, they noticed that the crumbs from the bread was floating all over the place. They were floating all inside of that capsule. And, of course, the problem is that those crumbs could have gotten into their systems or into their eyes while it's floating around. Or even worse, they could have inhaled those crumbs. And, nothing messes with reentry like hacking on rye bread, right? So they put it away, of course. But NASA had heard every word of their conversation, and they ended up getting in a lot of trouble. So eventually, once they landed again, they had to publicly apologize to Congress for possibly jeopardizing the mission. But believe it or not, and they didn't lose their jobs, don't worry. But it's actually for this reason now that if astronauts want to eat a sandwich in space, they don't use bread. Instead, they use tortillas because tortillas are flat packed and they don't really make crumbs like that. Smart, right? So that's our fun corned beef sandwich story. We do love to tell it because, again, it did happen on the Gemini 3 mission, which is one of those missions that we got to pick up. So very cool story. We love talking about space food here at the Intrepid. So everyone, I want to pause one more time, see if we've got any other questions before we move on. All right, were any other capsule programs named after mythology? Oh, wonderful question. So actually, yeah. Actually, all of them, pretty much. You've got Mercury, right? You've got Gemini, right? We talked about the constellation in the story there too. Castor and Pollux, that's what it was named for. And then, of course, now then you have Apollo right after it, which took us to the moon, which is actually kind of ironic because Apollo is the sun god, right? But they liked the idea of, Apollo pulling that chariot across the sky, chariot of fire, kind of like the rocket streaking across the sky and everything that represented. So that's why they named it that. And actually now we've got the Artemis missions coming up. In mythology, Artemis is the twin sister of Apollo. So that's very symbolic because it is not only the name of our missions that are going to bring the next man to the moon, but also the first woman back to the moon as well. So hopefully those are coming up in a few years. In about 2024, they are getting all excited and ramping up for that. But also they named other things other than missions too. They actually named rockets after mythological things. So you have rockets named like Thor and Atlas and Centaur and Saturn. Saturn V, of course, was the big one that took us to the moon. And then you've also got other spacecraft that's named it too. Things like Aquarius, which was a lunar module that ended up actually being a lifeboat for Apollo 13, if you've ever, heard that story or seen that movie. And Orion, which is kind of, a newest series of capsules there that they were using for NASA. So it's just, I don't know, that naming tradition also just sort of started and they kept going with it. But I think it's very inspiring. Mythology is very open-ended. It's very imaginative. And again, it's very inspiring with all of those gods and stories too. So makes a lot of sense. Why not? We're reaching for the stars. All right. Any other questions? Oh, do they eat better food in space now? Well, I mean, I guess it depends on what you consider better. Maybe some people happen to like dehydrated baby food. I don't know. I don't judge. But generally speaking, I would say yes. They actually have people whose entire job is to come up with delicious and nutritious meals for astronauts. And they've got a gigantic menu that they can choose from, all a la carte. They can pick everything they want. They can have special dishes for their birthday or for holidays or anything they want. And actually, funny enough, one of the most popular dishes that they have up there is none other than shrimp cocktail. And it all has to do with the cocktail sauce, actually. When you are in space, again, it's microgravity, so the crumbs float around, but also the fluids in your body start to shift around a bit too. And a lot of them actually kind of swell up and accumulate up in your head and your nasal passages. So it's sort of that feeling of, being congested, if you have a cold maybe. And when that happens, sometimes you lose your sense of taste too a little bit. So when astronauts are up in space, they often actually report feeling that fluid shift. So when that happens, again, your taste buds aren't really working the right way. So your taste buds get affected. And astronauts apparently really love spicy foods when they're in space because they can taste it better. So of course, the cocktail sauce has all that horseradish in it. It's very tangy. It's very spicy. So they love their shrimp cocktail. It's all, kind of mixed up in a pouch there too. But there you go. Spicy foods for the astronauts. Definitely a choice for them. All right, my friends. So what are some things that we know about space? I am going to take this off the screen here. Tell me in the chat, everyone, what are some things that we happen to know about space? What are some things that you know? We talked about things like, microgravity, right? Pop it in the chat for me. Things are a little weird up there. It definitely can take a toll on the human body over time. Definitely affects you differently in a lot of ways, but even more so if you're not in a capsule and you happen to not be wearing a spacesuit either. So what are some things we know, right? The gravity is different, microgravity, things float a little bit. Also some things like, we have no air up there, right? You need air to breathe. So you really need the air up there. And also something that we take for granted here on Earth, we're surrounded by an atmosphere, right? And that helps to maintain our air pressure. So air pressure is something that is every day all around us. We've got about 15 pounds of air pressing down on every square inch of our body all the time. So 15 pounds, it's about the weight of, a vacuum cleaner or a bar stool, or I don't know, my cat's about 15 pounds, I guess. He's actually a little chunky. But again, that's all over us all the time. We've gotten pretty used to it, and our bodies are always kind of pressing against it, and we're used to that. But in space, we are outside of our atmosphere. Space is a vacuum, okay? It lacks all matter. So there is very little gravity, there is no air, and there's no air pressure. So remember, our bodies, we are very well adjusted for living on Earth here, but not so much up there. So what I'm going to do, everyone, is now show you a really cool experiment that's going to demonstrate what might happen to your body if you were to go up into space without a fully working pressurized spacesuit on, or even no suit at all, based on some of these factors, all right? So here we go. What you see here, everyone, is actually something called a vacuum chamber, all right? So we are going to be able to recreate the conditions of space inside of this container by sucking out all of the air and everything out of it to create something called, again, a vacuum, which is basically nothing. So inside of this jar, we're going to test 3 different things. The first thing we're going to test is water because it makes up 60% of our body. So imagine this water that you see here is all the liquids in your body. It's your blood, your saliva, stuff like that. And like I said, we are going to suck all of the air out of that pump and we're going to create a vacuum in there to see what happens to the water. Now, before we start, I want to ask you all, and there you go. I stuck my finger in to show you. It's room temperature water. It's not hot. It's not cold. It's just room temperature. No problem. So everyone, before we get going with this, I do want to ask, what do you think is going to happen to that water in the vacuum chamber? All right. Do you think it's going to freeze? Do you think it's going to float? Do you think it's going to evaporate? Just take a guess. Tell me in the chat, what do you think is going to happen to that water? And again, it is just plain old room temperature water that's going in there straight from the faucet. Nothing's been added to it. So let's find out what happens, all right? So like I said, when that pump gets turned on, all right, it's going to start to suck all of the air out to create a vacuum. Now, as this happens, we got a little closer there. Watch what's going on here. You're going to start to notice something in just a couple of seconds. Oh, and I see there's a guess in the chat of what's going to happen. All right, so here on Earth, everyone, again, our atmosphere presses down on everything underneath it, including water. So typically, if we want to get water to evaporate or boil, as someone says in the chat, here on Earth, to boil something, you need to add heat, right? It warms up the molecules, gets them all excited, they start to move around faster, and then they separate and turn into a gas, and that is what creates those bubbles that you can see there. We're boiling here. But in outer space, we don't have to do that because there is no air pressure. The water already just wants to move around and spread out and evaporate. So this water is actually boiling, but without getting hot. And actually, if I let it just go there for long enough, it would eventually just evaporate away inside of that container. And it really kind of blows your mind, right? Because we associate that boiling water with heat, but it's really just happening on a molecular level. And as you can see, when we turn it off and reintroduce the air and open it up, I'm going to be able to touch it because it's still room temperature. It just lacks the air pressure that was causing it to bubble. Now, in 1966, there was actually a volunteer. Pause there. There's actually a volunteer test subject at NASA. His name was Jim LeBlanc, and he actually went inside of a large vacuum chamber. It was a test, of course. And after just about 15 seconds, he ended up passing out because there was a malfunction with his pressurized suit. But when he came to, he was okay. A couple minutes later, he said that the last thing he remembered was the saliva bubbling on his tongue. So there you go. That's that liquid, that saliva bubbling up, trying to move around because the air pressure was going away. All right. So the next thing, everyone, that we are going to look at here, we are going to test out some balloons. All right. One is inflated and one is deflated. All right. You're going to see these two, red and a blue balloon, and these are going to represent our lungs. So I want you to imagine the scenario. All right. You are out in space. You're in a big spaceship and you're going to get hit by some debris. All right. Now, the debris comes, it hits you, knocks a huge hole in the side of your spaceship, and you're going to get sucked out into space without a spacesuit on, but you see a rescue capsule nearby. So in this scenario, right before you get sucked out of your ship, do you think you should, A, inhale whatever remaining oxygen is in your ship, and, at the last minute, so take a deep breath in, fill up your lungs, fill up your lungs just like that red balloon there, fill them up, get all that air. Or B, do you think that you should breathe out and push all of the air out of your lungs like that other balloon, that blue one there? Which do you think you should do? Tell me in the chat, what do you think? Do you think you would take your deep breath in, suck up any extra air that happens to be in your spaceship before going out trying to get to that other ship? Or would you let all of the air out? What do you think? Me personally, I think human nature might kick in for most of us. I think I'd be gasping for any last bits of oxygen, just out of shock and panic in the moment. But let's see if that's actually a good idea. Here we go. So again, we're going to take all of the air out. We're going to create that vacuum inside there. And as we start to take the air out, you are going to notice here what's going on with that balloon. You see the red one kind of wiggling, and it's actually also getting bigger. Now, the blue one is actually getting a little bigger too, but the red one is getting a lot bigger there. And the reason why that's happening is because once we've removed all of the air pressure from around the balloons, just like the molecules in the water, the air want to spread out, they want to move around, that pressure is not keeping them down anymore. Again, the blue one is getting a little bigger. It's impossible to get all the air out, but that red one is spreading much, much bigger at this point. Kind of like if you're sharing a room with a sibling, and they move out, you get the room all to yourself. You're just going to spread your stuff all over too, right? So that's what the air is doing here. And it is getting pretty big, but don't worry, it's not going to pop. The container is actually not big enough for that. But if it did pop, you wouldn't be able to hear it because remember, in space, no one can hear you scream, which is true. There's no sound in space because there's no air in space to move the sound waves to let you hear it. So if it popped, we would not hear the sound. Now, here's the best part, everyone. As we put the atmosphere back into the container, there it goes. Those balloons shrink back down. They fly all over the place. And there you go. That's what happens. Now, another kind of side story here. In 1965, Soviet cosmonaut Alexei Leonov was the first person to perform a spacewalk. So again, this was before Ed White. Soviet Union was beating us to everything at that point. It actually was only about 12 minutes, but at the time, the Soviet engineers didn't account for the air in his suit expanding just like that balloon under the conditions of space. So when he tried to get back into his spaceship, that hole was kind of small and he couldn't fit back in again. That would be terrifying for me to be stuck in space. But he ended up having to partially depressurize his suit just so he could shrink back down enough to squeeze back inside again. There actually was also another interesting study that was done in 1965 on a bunch of dogs. And they found that when the dogs were exposed to a vacuum, it's a little yucky, their bowels and their lungs were immediately cleared out. So it's kind of safe to say, guys, you'd poop your pants too. And, then all those liquids would boil away too. But I guess on the plus side, there's no air, so you wouldn't be able to smell it, right? So we tested out the water, which represent our fluids, right? We tested out what might happen to the air in your lungs. Remember, breathe out. Now we are going to test out something that's going to represent our bodies. So our flesh, our guts, all right, all of your muscles and things like that. And everyone, here is what we are going to use to represent your body. Kind of what I'm feeling like these days, a marshmallow. So it's got kind of a squishy structure. It's made of actually 3 main ingredients: sugar, water, and air. So what do you think is going to happen to this marshmallow in our vacuum, everyone? What do you think there? Let's take any guesses. You want to put them in the chat. What's going to happen to our marshmallow when you put it in? What is going to happen? Sugar, water, and air. We actually talked about 2 of those things before. So maybe that might give you a little bit of a clue. Maybe that sugar has something else to do with it, though. I don't know. What's going to happen? All right. So finish up those last few guesses. We are going to put that vacuum back together again and see what happens. Here we go. So we are going to, again, take the air out, and we're going to see something really interesting happen here. Now, if you're watching this, you might notice the marshmallow is getting bigger. Now, inside the marshmallow, everyone, there's a bunch of air pockets. And like we saw with the balloons, those air pockets are expanding. They're getting bigger and bigger and bigger until they burst. And now you might notice that marshmallow looks like it's kind of leveled off. The air is escaping. It's starting to evaporate a bit, but it's staying the same. But look what happens when we add the atmosphere back in. Oh, look at that. Not very appetizing. It just shrivels up. It collapses on itself, and it looks kind of a bit dehydrated too. So the reason why this happens is because now all the air pockets are gone. So the structure of the marshmallow just collapses on itself. So what's that say about what's going to happen to your body? Well, there was a skydiver in 1960 who went up to about 20 miles above the Earth in a high-altitude balloon for an experiment. And he had a problem, actually, with the pressurization in his glove. And he said his hand actually ended up swelling up to twice its size while he was up there. But by the time that he actually came back down to Earth, it took 3 hours for his hand to return to normal size and stop hurting. It really hurt a lot. So basically, everyone, if your body is going to expand and your blood is evaporating and your lungs are swelling up and going to burst, now you can basically see why astronauts need to wear spacesuits when they go into outer space. So remember that. Next time you go into outer space, do not forget to wear your spacesuits. So actually, I have a funny joke for you. Why do astronauts wear spacesuits? Because they work better under pressure. right? Oh, bad. All right. So everyone, let's move right along. We talked about some space capsules, the Mercury and Gemini capsules. And of course, after that was Apollo, the ones that went to the moon, right? But now we are actually going to talk a little bit about a different type of technology after capsules. So after we got to the moon, after we won the space race, NASA decided rather than go out further into the universe, they instead wanted to focus on low Earth orbit and build things in space closer to home, things that could maybe instead look out into the universe, right? And that's what we did. And obviously, those smaller capsules were not going to help us to do that. So we needed to come up with something bigger, something better. And that is what led us to this, which actually was already behind me on my screen. All right. So this, everyone, is up on our flight deck of the Intrepid. This is the Space Shuttle Enterprise, and it's the very first space shuttle ever built. It is historic. And I'm actually going to tell you a really big, deep, dark, not so secret about this space shuttle, everyone. This space shuttle never went into outer space. It's true, but we do still love it, and it's still super important. So this, everyone, was a testing vehicle. It was something called a prototype. They needed to see if something this massive could actually even work, even get up there out into space, and then eventually actually glide back down through the atmosphere with this kind of airplane-looking design to ultimately even actually land on a runway, just like an airplane. Because remember, before that, the capsules that we were looking at, they were one-time use. They landed in the ocean. They were recovered. And then actually somebody asked earlier, what happened to the capsules? They put them in museums. They basically, took it. They took all the data off of it they needed to. They looked at it, made sure everything looked good. And now they're in museums across the country. So with this thing here, this space shuttle, NASA could reuse it over and over and over again. So it made a lot of sense. It was great. It was cost effective and it's beautiful. So they really had to, in their design, though, strike this balance of being able to make it land safely with 7 or 8 astronauts inside of it, but also big enough that it could bring things into outer space in its payload bed. So if you're looking at this, the majority of the shuttle is empty. It's actually kind of like the trunk of a car or the back of, a really big truck almost. That area in the back there was actually used to bring up big, heavy space equipment like pieces of the International Space Station or big telescopes like the Hubble Space Telescope and satellites and things. So it was the orbiter's job to put those things into space so that we could then learn more and further our understanding of space. That payload bay is basically, if you see the front, right behind where like the cockpit window is, there's kind of a line there. All of that middle part up into where you see the kind of the round pieces in the back of it, that whole thing is the payload bay. It's gigantic. Now, the Enterprise, though, did not go into outer space, but it did actually go up into the sky. And here's some photos of an actual test flight that it did. So now, normally, when these things go up into space, they're attached to a rocket. There's giant fuel tanks, again, lots of fire, but it didn't use a rocket during testing. Instead, it got a piggyback ride from a 747 airplane, as you can see here. So back in 1977, this jet lumbered down the runway and eventually took off with, as you can see, a space shuttle on its back. And it went up to about 26,000 feet. It was going about 470 miles an hour, which actually is not really that high or that fast for this sort of thing. And then it dropped it. It separated from it. And then it was the Enterprise's job to just become a glider, basically. It became like a paper airplane and it glided around. All it really has are those wings and the tail, and it just made banking turns to slow itself down as it fell through the sky before then ultimately landing on a runway, just like an airplane had an airport. So after NASA was satisfied with the tests, they made a few other changes, and then they created 5 other orbiters that were used to go into space. Now, in 2011, not too long ago, 10, 11 years ago, NASA actually retired the space shuttle program. So we do not use them anymore. And actually, instead, we went back to using capsules, kind of like this one. So what you see here is actually a Soyuz capsule. This one is in our Space Shuttle Pavilion on display, and it has actually been to outer space. And you can actually see right at the top, there's like a lighter colored area of it. If you look closely there, it's got some scorch marks, actually. Those are bird marks from re-entry when it was coming back through the atmosphere. But this is actually what astronauts used to go into outer space after shuttles. So the capsules were sent up by Russia, and then only until fairly recently, they basically sold seats to the United States in order to get up to the International Space Station. Now, looking at that, how many people do you think can fit inside of that thing? It almost looks smaller, doesn't it? That is a Soyuz capsule. It's pretty small looking. How many people do you think can fit in there? The answer, everyone, is 3. But look at how cramped that thing is, right? Look at those 3 people squished inside of that Soyuz capsule. So 3 astronauts would go up in a rocket into space in this thing. And what's really interesting about these is that they don't land on water like our earliest capsules or like the ones that we have now that are coming back. These ones actually landed on land in the desert in Kazakhstan. And obviously, to come in, they had to be careful. They had some extra parachutes that would come out. And they also had explosives that would explode outward on the bottom, too, to give it kind of a last minute boost when coming in for that landing. So that's what that picture is there. But yeah, they would land in the middle of the desert because it's, Russia's a landlocked country pretty much. So basically, that's what it was. That's what we used. But again, the space shuttle program was retired in 2011. So when the museum got Enterprise back in 2012, we actually were so excited that we got it. We decided to celebrate it the way that it all began, on the back of a 747 jet, doing a victory lap around Manhattan. So everyone, if you look at this picture, this is just a phenomenal, fun picture. I love this picture so much. This is, of course, the Enterprise on the back, again, of a 747 jet. And if you look directly under it, you can actually see the back of the Intrepid. It looks a little different now. A few years later, we've got actually a Space Shuttle Pavilion. It's a little house that we keep our space shuttle inside of. But you can still see the white Concorde sitting there on the pier, too, right next to it, that we do have on display as well on the pier. But there it is. And, of course, the beautiful New York City skyline as well. So everyone, that concludes our Journey to Space program for today. Thank you so much for joining me as I shared some really neat space stuff that we've got at the museum. And I just want to see if we've got any other final questions before we round out for the day. How many space shuttles were created? Yeah, so in all, there were 6 space shuttles made, including Enterprise. But again, only 5 of them actually went into space. And sadly, we lost 2 of them in accidents. So those were Challenger and Columbia. So that means there's 4 of them left, one of which we do, of course, have here at the Intrepid Museum. And the others are in other places, other museums. There's one at the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C. There's also one in a science museum out across the country in Los Angeles in California. And then the other one is in Kennedy Space Center down in Florida. So there you go. There are 4 of them still remaining. So, get your bingo cards out. Try to go around the country and see those. Any other questions? Did the shuttles use fuel as they were landing? Nope. They were just a glider. It re-entered Earth's atmosphere just like a paper airplane, again, just gliding down to an airport runway. And it does, of course, have those flight surfaces that can slightly move to help it. So, it would be able to make turns and the air would hit it a certain way so it could shift its weight certain ways. But yeah, it would just basically make those big wide turns to steer it as it flew down. And that was it. No fuel needed, within our atmosphere. It launched from a launch pad with lots of fuel and rocket power. But coming in, it was coming so quick, it didn't really need fuel to get going. Gravity's already doing that for you. It just mainly needed to be able to steer itself back home again. Yep. All right. Great questions, everyone. So if you've got any other questions, though, about our programs, you can reach out to us through our website, intrepidmuseum.org, or also through social media. I want to thank you all so much again for watching, for sharing your questions and comments with me today. Do be sure to follow or subscribe to this channel that you're watching now, and visit our website for our upcoming programs. On that note, everyone, we are going to be taking a hiatus for a little bit to prepare for some awesome new 40th anniversary content that we'll be sharing for you. By the way, I think I mentioned it earlier. Did you know this year's the 40th anniversary of our museum, guys? Yay! So We will have one last program. Our next and last streaming program for family programs is next week, Thursday at 3 p.m., same time, same place. And it's going to be Stellar Spacecraft. And there's a special reason for it. We are going to explore a number of the engineering marvels that helped us not only to keep astronauts safe, but also land vehicles on the moon and Mars. But don't worry, everyone. You can always check back for other archive content on our YouTube and Facebook pages as well if you get lonely and miss me. But we are specifically going to be doing that particular program because we are going to be receiving and hosting a full-scale model of the Perseverance rover and the Ingenuity helicopter that is on Mars right now. Coming up, we are actually celebrating the 1-year anniversary of Mars landing, of the Mars landing. So next week on Thursday, actually, same day as our program, but at night, we are going to be having a special virtual astronomy live as we do every month. And this month, we're celebrating the 1-year anniversary of the Mars Perseverance landing. So we're going to be chatting with the Ingenuity helicopter team leader, who's going to give us updates. He's going to talk all about his experience working on the Ingenuity helicopter, including what's going on up there right now. You won't want to miss it. He's also going to talk about the next generation of space helicopters and things. So be sure to tune in. That is next Thursday after this last streaming program at 5 p.m. on our streaming platforms and also on nasaspaceflight.com. Lastly, I also want to plug so much exciting news going on, guys. I want to plug that coming up starting next Saturday, February 19th through 26th is Kids Week. It's back, and we are moving full steam ahead with activities and programs for the whole family all week long. So the first 3 days are NASA days. That's the 19th, 20th, and 21st. We are going to have astronauts. So we're going to have scientists and engineers on site giving demonstrations and talks, and also a bunch of other amazing partners ranging from zoo animals to Broadway shows the rest of the week. Don't miss it. We are back on the ship and we are ready to have some fun. So be sure to come by. You can get more information about Kids Week or any of our upcoming programs and events on our website, again, intrepidmuseum.org. All right, everyone. So once again, thank you so much for joining us today, and I'll see you next time for another virtual Intrepid adventure. See you next time, everyone. Bye-bye.